Everyone in the building laughed the moment they heard the announcement. The event coordinator, a cheerful woman in a red blazer, who clearly enjoyed her own sense of humor, had just called out the final pairing of the night, Daniel Carter and Elena Brooks, and the reaction from the crowd said everything that needed to be said, without a single syllable of cruelty being spoken aloud. The laughter rippled through the grand ballroom of Hartwell and Associates, like a small, satisfied wave, the kind that comes not from joy but from the relief of knowing you are not the one being laughed at. It was the company's annual winter gala, held every December in the polished 43rd floor event space, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city lights below, and for most of the 500 employees packed into that room, the evening had been going exactly as planned: free cocktails, polished speeches, a jazz quartet in the corner, and the long-running tradition of the so-called mystery pairing game, where names were drawn to determine dinner table companions. Most pairings were forgettable. This one was not. The building at night was a different place from the building in the day. And Daniel understood this in a way that none of the daytime employees ever would. The offices that hummed with managed urgency between 9 and 6 became, after midnight, something quieter and more honest, the fluorescent lights giving the corridors a quality that was neither warm nor cold but simply functional, the way light looks when nobody is performing for it. He had moved through hundreds of thousands of hours of this particular quiet, and what he had come to understand was that the building's personality changed not because it was empty, but because the absence of audience revealed something that the audience's presence had been masking. The conference rooms, stripped of their strategic urgency, were just rooms. The executive offices, absent their occupants, were just furniture around a view. Daniel had mopped the floors of the highest and lowest levels of this building with equal thoroughness, and the floors on the 47th were not fundamentally different from the floors on the first. This was not a political observation. It was simply what he had noticed. Daniel Carter was 38 years old, and he had worked the overnight maintenance shift at Hartwell and Associates for 11 years. He knew every hallway in the building, every stubborn drain, every light fixture that buzzed slightly louder than it should. He had mopped marble floors while executives held late-night strategy sessions behind closed glass doors. And he had done it with the same quiet efficiency every single time. No complaints, no demands, no desire to be seen. He was a tall man, lean, with the kind of hands that showed years of physical work without apology. And he carried himself with a stillness that most people in that building had simply never noticed. He had been invited to the gala because the company had made a point, at least on paper, of including all staff. He sat near the back in a pressed but visibly old charcoal blazer, nursing a glass of water, watching the room with calm, dark eyes that missed very little. Elena Brooks was 35, a former marketing manager who had left the company under circumstances that had become, over time, something of a corporate legend told in whispers. She had led a product launch campaign 2 years prior that had collapsed spectacularly, the kind of failure that gets dissected in case studies and referenced in team meetings as a cautionary tale. And though the full story was more complicated than anyone had bothered to remember, what stuck was the simplified version. Elena Brooks had failed, and she had failed publicly. She had been invited back to the gala by a former colleague who meant well, but had underestimated how much the room still remembered. She wore a navy dress that had been fashionable 3 seasons ago. And she sat near the edge of the room, with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed at a point somewhere just past the centerpiece of her table, as if she had already decided that the safest strategy for the evening was to become invisible. The laughter was loudest when the coordinator read their names together, because someone in the crowd had clearly engineered the pairing. The matching game used a digital randomizer that was, in theory, neutral, but everyone who knew Marcus Webb, the mid-level sales director who sat closest to the laptop that controlled the display, knew that randomness had very little to do with what happened that night. Marcus thought it was funny. Several people around him thought it was funny. The beauty and the janitor, someone muttered. And a few people laughed at that too. Elena heard it from across the room. She did not move. She simply lowered her chin by a fraction of an inch, and anyone who had ever felt the precise weight of public humiliation would have recognized that posture immediately. It was the posture of someone deciding how much of themselves to protect and how quickly. Daniel heard the laughter too. He had heard it aimed in his direction before, at his uniform, at his mop, at the cart he wheeled through the corridor each night. He set his water glass down on the table and stood up. And for one brief moment the room was still watching, ready for whatever performance came next, ready to be entertained a little longer at the expense of two people who had not asked for any of this. Daniel crossed the ballroom floor without rushing. He reached Elena's table. He looked at her not with pity, not with performance, but with the plain, direct attention of someone who had decided what kind of person he was going to be, regardless of who was watching, and he pulled out the chair beside her. He did not say anything right away. He simply waited. Elena looked up at him. She looked at the chair. She looked back at him. And she sat down. The laughter in the room did not stop immediately, but something shifted in its quality. Some small, essential thing that made it feel less like entertainment and more like exposure. The truth about Daniel Carter was that he had spent more than a decade becoming the kind of man that most of the people in that ballroom would not have believed him capable of being, precisely because they had never thought to ask. His days were structured around invisibility, or rather, he had learned to move through the world in a way that did not demand acknowledgement, because demanding acknowledgement had cost him things before. He arrived at the Hartwell building each evening at 9:30 and left before the first morning shift employees began filtering in, and in the hours between, he moved through 32 floors of corporate life like a quiet current. He swept conference rooms where the whiteboards still held the half-erased remnants of heated arguments. He emptied trash cans that contained the evidence of people's anxieties, energy drink cans, printed emails covered in handwritten notes, the occasional crumpled resignation letter that had never been sent. He wiped down kitchen counters in break rooms, and occasionally, when he found a machine jammed or a faucet running at the wrong pressure, he fixed it, not because it was in his job description, but because he was there and he knew how, and because leaving things broken when you had the means to fix them had never sat right with him. Nobody thanked him for the extra things. Most people did not notice them at all. The younger employees were the most direct about their indifference. There was a group in the digital marketing division, mid-20s, loud, the kind of effortlessly confident that sometimes masquerades as actual personality, who had given Daniel a nickname he had overheard once, while pushing his cart past their cluster of desks. They called him the NPC, as in the non-player character from video games, the background figure who exists only to fill space, who has no interior life, who is scenery rather than story. One of them had even done an impression once, mimicking the motion of mopping the floor with exaggerated blankness. And the others had laughed, and not one of them had looked over their shoulder to check if he was nearby. He was. He had finished emptying the recycling bin 2 feet behind them and left without a word. He was not unaffected by these things. He simply had a very clear sense of what it cost to let cruelty reorganize you from the inside, and he was not willing to pay that price. He had made that calculation early in his years at Hartwell, standing alone in an empty corridor at 2 a.m. with a mop in his hands and a quality of silence around him that could have been loneliness if he had let it be. And he had chosen, quietly and without ceremony, not to let it be. Instead, he had built a life that sustained him in ways the people who mocked him would not have understood or thought to look for. He read voraciously history, philosophy, psychology, whatever the public library near his apartment could offer, and he had done this for years, quietly accumulating a depth of understanding about human behavior that had no credential attached to it and no audience to validate it. And that suited him fine. He had dropped out of college at 22, after his mother's illness had demanded everything his family had, financially and emotionally. And he had made peace with that choice a long time ago, though peace did not mean it had stopped mattering. It simply meant he had decided not to let it define the ceiling of what he could become on the inside, even if the outside remained the same uniform, and the same cart, and the same corridors at the same late hour. There were small acts that his co-workers never witnessed and never would. A night shift security guard named Terrence, who ate dinner alone in the lobby, had found, more than once, a container of food left near his station with no note. It was always Daniel, who had noticed Terrence never seemed to bring enough, and who had simply started bringing extra without announcing it. A junior accountant named Sophie had spent 40 minutes crying in the second-floor bathroom one Tuesday in October and when she emerged, she found a small stack of tissues placed neatly on the counter beside the sink along with a paper cup of water that had not been there when she went in. She had told a friend about it later, calling it one of the strangest and most comforting moments of her year, and she had no idea who was responsible. These were not grand gestures. They were the gestures of someone who paid attention and acted on what he noticed, without needing anyone to connect the dots back to him. And so when Elena Brooks said to him, quietly, during a pause in the noise of the ballroom, "Thank you for not laughing at me," she said it because she had been watching him across that table for the better part of 20 minutes, and she could not find a single moment in which his expression had held anything other than the plain, undramatic attention of a man who was genuinely present in a room full of people who were only performing presence. Elena had spent the 2 years since leaving Hartwell in the kind of suspended, muffled state that follows a public failure of significant magnitude. She had applied for positions and been rejected, sometimes explicitly and sometimes with the particular silence of companies that stop returning calls after the reference check stage. She had freelanced, taking on projects that were smaller than her capability, but that paid the kind of reliable money that an uncertain situation requires, and she had done the work competently, without anyone particularly noticing either the competence or the quiet effort behind it. She had moved apartments once, to a smaller place on the east side, that had better light in the mornings, and she had told herself that the move was practical, when in reality, it had been partly about escaping a street she associated with the version of herself she was trying to stop being. She had a few close friends who had stayed close, and she was grateful for them in the specific, sober way you are grateful for things you have seen other people lose. But she had been carrying the weight of what Hartwell represented, not just the failure, but the way the failure had been made into entertainment, by people who should have known her better, and that weight had a quality that close friends and new apartments could reduce but could not resolve. The gala had moved into its later stages. The speeches had been given, the awards distributed, the open bar queue reduced to its final stragglers, and the assigned seating had, as it always does at events like this, dissolved into the natural gravitational clusters of people who already knew each other well, which meant that Daniel and Elena found themselves at a side table near the window, slightly apart from the main current of the evening, eating the last of the catered dinner with the particular freedom that comes from being the two people nobody is currently watching. Elena had not planned to say anything meaningful. She had planned, as she had been planning all evening, to survive the event with minimal additional damage and leave before anyone remembered she was there. But something about the quality of Daniel's silence, the way it was not awkward or expectant but simply present, the way he ate his food and looked out at the city lights without any apparent need for her to perform or explain herself, made the planned silence feel unnecessary. She told him things she had not said out loud in 2 years. She told him about the campaign, not the sanitized version, but the full version. The one where she had been given a half-formed brief, an inadequate budget, a timeline that an experienced director had privately told her was impossible, and a team that had been silently promised to another project and had been giving her their leftovers. She told him about the launch date, when the metrics had come back catastrophic, and her director had stood in front of the executive team and used the phrase Elena's strategy 4 times in 15 minutes, while never once mentioning the structural conditions that had made success nearly impossible. She told him about the weeks afterward, when colleagues who had eaten lunch with her for 3 years began finding reasons to be somewhere else whenever she came near. She told him about the exit meeting, where HR had been professionally kind in a way that made the whole thing feel even more surreal, and about the drive home afterward, when she had sat in her car in a parking garage for 45 minutes because she could not figure out how to carry what had just happened into the rest of her life. She had almost not come tonight, she said. She had stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes before leaving, trying on 4 different outfits and putting them all back, and she had arrived telling herself she would stay for exactly 1 hour and then go home and not look back. She did not explain why she had stayed past the 1-hour mark. She did not need to. The answer was sitting across the table from her. Daniel listened the way people rarely listen, without preparing his response, without looking for the place where he could insert his own experience, without the particular performance of empathy that involves nodding too frequently and saying the right words at calculated intervals. He just listened, and occasionally looked at her with eyes that held no pity and no judgment, and no visible need for the conversation to resolve itself into something more comfortable. When Elena finished talking and sat quietly with her fork resting on the edge of her plate, he was quiet for a moment too. Then he said, in a voice that was unhurried and plain, "There are rooms that laugh at other people, because it's the only way they can feel like the room is full." Elena looked at him. She opened her mouth and closed it again. She had expected, if anything, consolation, reassurance, the standard emotional scaffolding that people offer when they want to be helpful without getting too close. She had not expected something that landed like that, precise and true, in the exact center of what she had been carrying. She felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of some long-held brace. And to her own surprise and considerable embarrassment, she began to cry quietly, without drama, in the way people cry when the tears are not about sadness so much as release, when something that has been held for a very long time is finally allowed to simply stop being held. She pressed her hand over her eyes and said, very quietly, that she was sorry. Daniel handed her a folded paper napkin and said there was nothing to be sorry for. He meant it. She knew he meant it. It had been raining for a while before either of them noticed. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows streaked with light and water, the streets far below reflecting the scattered amber of the lamps. The gala was winding down by the time they left, a slow dispersal of people moving toward coats and elevators, and the particular social mechanics of ending an evening among colleagues who see each other too often to say real goodbyes. And when Daniel and Elena stepped out of the building onto the main avenue, the rain was still coming down, soft and steady. The kind that is not quite cold enough to be uncomfortable, but is persistent enough to matter. Daniel reached into the inside of his blazer, without thinking, and produced a folded canvas jacket, the kind of worn, impractical garment that speaks of years of use, rather than fashion, and held it over Elena's head, before she had time to decide whether she wanted the gesture. She laughed, briefly and genuinely, which surprised them both. They walked. The walk home that night, or rather, the walk that took them in the general direction of home before they both realized neither of them was in a particular hurry. To end the conversation covered perhaps 20 blocks through the softly lit, rain-dampened streets of a city that had not been consulted on the evening's emotional agenda, and therefore provided a neutral, indifferent backdrop that suited both of them. They passed a late-night diner with condensation on the windows, and the particular warm glow of a place that takes no interest in the hour. They passed a woman walking a large dog in a yellow rain slicker, the dog sniffing at the base of a lamppost, with the thorough, unhurried investigation of a creature that had nowhere else to be. They passed a shuttered flower stall, with a faded awning, and a hand-lettered sign that said, "Back at 7. And Elena thought about the person who had written that sign, and whether they knew how much ordinary persistence it took to put a sign like that up every single day, to commit, in handwriting, to the fact of returning. Daniel said very little during most of the walk, which was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who understood that not every moment of companionship required language to sustain it. Elena, who had spent 2 years surrounded by the particular kind of noise that fills the space where real conversation used to be, noticed this, and found it more restful than she had words for yet. The city was quieter than it had any right to be for a Friday night. Or perhaps it only seemed that way because the two of them were moving through it at a pace that belonged to a different register of the evening. Elena asked questions she had not planned to ask, and Daniel answered them in the way he answered most things, directly, without embellishment, but with a depth that kept catching her off guard. She asked how he had ended up doing what he did for as long as he had. He told her about his mother, about the years when money had been the kind of problem that reorders every other priority, and about the job that had been available, and had paid enough, and had eventually become simply the shape of his days. He told her about the library, the one 6 blocks from his apartment, that he had been going to 3 or 4 nights a week for the better part of a decade, working his way through sections without particular plan or urgency. He told her that he had read more philosophy than most philosophy professors, probably, which was a claim he made with a brief, dry smile that suggested he found it more absurd than proud. She asked him why the reading, why the sustained investment in understanding things when the world he moved through every day gave him so little credit for it. He was quiet for a moment, watching the rain fall in thin lines past a street lamp. He said that he had needed to understand people, and that books had been the most reliable way he had found to do that, and that understanding people had made it easier to be kind to them even when they made it difficult. He paused. He said, "And because I know what it feels like to be treated like you're not there." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Elena thought about what it must be like to carry that much interior life through a world that had decided, based on the uniform and the mop and the late-night hours, that there was nothing inside worth looking for. She felt something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but had elements of both. They were standing at a corner when her phone lit up a message from a former colleague. And when Elena opened it, she found a screenshot. She looked at it for a moment without fully processing what she was seeing, and then she processed it. And the warmth of the previous hour contracted sharply into something cold and precise and familiar. The photo had been taken from across the ballroom sometime during the dinner, Daniel and Elena in profile at the side table, leaning slightly toward each other, in the way people do when the conversation has become genuine, the city lights visible behind the glass in soft, blurred columns. In isolation, it was a perfectly ordinary image of two people talking. In context, captioned, cropped, and posted to the company's internal network with the phrase "Beauty and the Janitor," annual romance arc confirmed it was something else entirely. By the time Elena saw it, the post had accumulated dozens of reactions and a comment thread that ranged from laughing emojis to elaborate jokes at both their expenses. Someone had already made a follow-up image, using their faces cut out and imposed on a movie poster. It had been live for less than 2 hours. Elena stared at her phone screen in the rain. Her first feeling was a familiar one. Contracting shame of being publicly mocked, the way it reduces a person to the version of themselves that exists in other people's cruelty. Her second feeling was something sharper and more complicated, because in the photograph, Daniel looked like himself, calm and present and entirely dignified, and the caption had not touched that, but the cruelty of the intent had been aimed at him too, and that felt different from when it was aimed only at her. Something tightened in her chest that was not shame at all. It was anger. Clean, clarifying, quiet anger. The following Monday, Daniel was called into the office of Robert Sloan, the building operations manager, who functioned as the closest thing the maintenance staff had to a direct supervisor within Hartwell's corporate structure. Sloan was not a mean man, but he was a careful one, and the distinction between the two was relevant. He told Daniel, in a measured tone that conveyed the information without quite acknowledging its ugliness, that the post had created a certain perception issue, and that going forward, it would be appreciated if Daniel maintained appropriate professional distance at company events. Daniel listened to all of it without expression. He said he understood, which was true. He understood exactly what was being communicated and exactly what it revealed about the people communicating it, and he left the office and went back to his shift. Elena, when she found out, wanted to go to Sloan's office herself and say things that would not have been productive. She found Daniel instead and told him she was sorry. She said this was her fault for existing in proximity to him, that she should have stayed home, that she would find a way to fix it. Daniel looked at her for a moment. With the particular patient attention of a man who has heard many people be wrong about themselves, he said, quietly and without dramatics, "The person who should be ashamed is not you." And he meant the specific people who had done the specific things, and she knew it, and for a moment she felt something in her chest that was the precise opposite of the small, contracting shame she had been carrying. What happened next, nobody had planned. Daniel had been eating lunch, a sandwich he had brought from home in a reusable container in the first-floor cafeteria, which at noon on Tuesday was at full capacity with the midday wave of employees from the lower floors. Someone at a nearby table made a joke. Daniel did not hear the full content of it, but he heard the laughter, and he heard his name used in the careless shorthand of people who have reduced another human being to a recurring punchline. He set down his sandwich. He stood up. In a room of approximately 200 people, standing up from a table should not have commanded the kind of attention it did, but something in the quality of Daniel Carter's stillness, the particular unhurried purposefulness with which he rose, made the nearest tables go quiet first, and quiet, in enclosed spaces, is contagious. The cafeteria was fully lit and fully occupied. The kind of room that hums with the layered noise of 200 simultaneous conversations. Silverware on ceramic, chairs scraping, the espresso machine in the corner cycling through its routine. It took perhaps 20 seconds from the moment Daniel stood to the moment the room understood collectively, and with the slow, uncomfortable recognition of a crowd that has been caught doing something. It cannot easily walk back from that something was about to be said. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to rooms quiet themselves for the person who is calm when everyone else is performing. He looked around at the tables nearest to him. He said, "I've worked in this building for 11 years. He paused, letting the number sit in the air. "I've cleaned up after every one of your parties. I've emptied your trash and fixed your machines and worked through every holiday this company has given you time off for. And in 11 years, fewer than a dozen people in this building have asked my name." He let that stand. The hum of the room had dropped to something close to actual silence. 2 nights ago, someone made a joke at the expense of a woman who came to a company party alone because someone told her she was welcome here. She sat at a side table and she did not do anything to anyone. And this building spent 2 days making entertainment out of her. He looked at the table where the joke had come from, not with anger, but with the plain, unsparing attention of someone who has decided to see clearly and be seen seeing clearly. "I want to know something," he said. "I want to know what it is that any of you has done specifically, concretely, that makes you certain enough of your own value, that you spend your energy reducing other people's." He waited a moment, as if the question was genuine, and he was prepared to hear an answer. No answer came. He went on. He talked about the years of invisible labor, not in self-pity, not in accusation, but with the measured factual register of someone delivering a testimony that has been building for a long time, and has finally found its moment without apology. He talked about the things he had witnessed from the position of a man the building had decided was background, the late-night loneliness of people who had every credential and no one to call, the quiet devastation of the woman who pressed the elevator button for the highest floor every morning, with the expression of someone going somewhere that had cost her more than she'd budgeted for, the way the building's most outwardly confident employees often became in the empty hallways of 11 o'clock, something smaller and more uncertain than the version they performed during business hours. He said, "I've seen a lot of people cry in this building over 11 years. Not one of them was crying because they had too much to be grateful for." He paused one final time. He looked around the room one more time, slowly, without hostility. He said, "A job that most people look down on does not make a person lesser. Choosing to look down on people is what does that." He sat back down. He picked up his sandwich. The cafeteria remained very quiet for a long time. A woman named Christine, a financial analyst on the 7th floor who had laughed at the original gala pairing along with the rest of the room, found herself staring at her lunch without appetite, and with a feeling in her chest that she recognized as shame, not the comfortable, abstract shame of someone who has read about injustice, but the specific, localized shame of someone who has done a small thing that was wrong, and has just been made to see it clearly. She would think about that moment for weeks. She was not alone in that. Elena, who had been sitting 2 tables away, and had watched the whole thing unfold in a state of frozen, disbelieving attention, felt something move through her that was not quite like anything she had experienced before. Not relief, not gratitude, though it contained both, but something more structural, something that had to do with being defended in the presence of the people who had been the source of the wound. Someone at the table behind her had already pulled out a phone. The video appeared that evening. Someone had filmed it on a phone, held just below table level, the angle slightly off, the framing imperfect, but the audio entirely clear and the content unmistakable. It moved through the informal channels of the internet, with the particular velocity reserved for things that strike a specific nerve at a specific moment, and within 48 hours it had been seen by an audience that extended far beyond the walls of Hartwell and Associates. The comments divided, as they always do, into those who understood what they were seeing and those who needed to perform skepticism about it. Some said it was staged. Some found reasons to reframe the whole situation in ways that protected their existing position on the hierarchy of who deserves consideration and who does not. But the larger portion of the response was different. People talked about the Daniels in their own buildings, the maintenance workers and cafeteria staff and security guards, whose daily presence had formed the invisible structure of their professional lives for years, without ever being acknowledged. People talked about the times they had failed publicly, and felt the particular social coldness of a room withdrawing its warmth without a word of explanation. Elena read through hundreds of responses from her apartment on the second night. Sitting cross-legged on her couch, with her laptop balanced on her knees, she had anticipated the cruel segment and found it, and it stung in the predictable ways. But what she had not anticipated was the volume of the other segment, the people who wrote things like "I was in her position once and I didn't think I was going to come back from it, and someone did something like what he did for me when I was at the lowest point I'd ever been, and I'm still here because of it." She read those messages for a long time. She did not feel rescued, exactly. She felt something more complicated and more useful than rescue. She felt less singular in her experience. Less specifically broken, less like a cautionary tale, and more like a person who had had a hard time and might yet become part of a different kind of story. She texted Daniel, "Are you okay with all of this?" He replied after a pause, "I'm fine." "Are you?" She wrote back. "I think so. I think more than I was." He sent a single affirmative response. She stared at her phone and then put it down and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the tentative beginning of something that was not dread. At Hartwell, the response was swift. Margaret Lowe, the CEO, had been watching the situation develop since the gala, with the kind of attention that senior executives give situations when they understand that what is external news is also internal truth. She called Daniel to her office on the 47th floor on a Thursday morning. Daniel rode the elevator past floors he had only ever accessed with a maintenance key, watching the numbers climb, and he was not nervous. He had said what he said because it was true, and because the moment had presented itself, and he had made peace with whatever came next. Margaret Lowe was already standing when he came in. She thanked him for coming. She told him she was sorry clearly, without qualification, without the corporate hedging that would have made the word mean something smaller than it needed to mean. She said the company had been allowing a culture of casual cruelty to calcify for years, and that what had happened to Daniel and Elena had made visible something she had known in abstract and failed to address in practice, and that she intended to address it now. She had, she said, received 3 separate internal complaints about workplace culture in the past year, all of them describing exactly the kind of behavior that had been directed at both of them, and she had handled them with process and insufficient consequence. She was not going to do that again. Then she asked Daniel what he wanted. He thought about the question with the unhurried attention he gave most things. He said he did not want to be the face of anything, not a campaign, not a moment, not a symbol someone could point to as evidence of having resolved something that had not yet been resolved. He said the one thing he actually wanted was for the building to function differently in the small daily practices of acknowledgement that cost nothing and mean more than most people understand until they have been without them. He looked at the CEO of a company that had employed him for 11 years and told her, "Learn their names." That was what he wanted. Learn the names of the people who clean the floors and staff the lobby and run the freight elevators. Learn them and use them. That was enough. Margaret Lowe wrote something down. Elena, who had been asked to attend and had not known until she arrived that Daniel would also be there, stood near the window, watching the man she had met less than 2 weeks ago and hold his position in the most powerful office she had ever stood in, and she thought about the chair and the jacket and the cafeteria, and she thought about who he had been in each of those moments, and she found that the consistency of it, the way he had been exactly himself, regardless of the audience, or the stakes, or the occasion, was the thing that moved her most. In the days that followed, something at Hartwell began to change, not in the dramatic, resolving way of stories that need to be finished cleanly, but in the slower, more genuine way of real institutions beginning to reckon with themselves. A colleague who had made several of the cruelest posts about Elena found her in the break room on a Wednesday morning and said, without preamble and with the awkward directness of someone who had rehearsed the words enough to say them, but not enough to say them smoothly, "I was wrong to do what I did. I'm sorry." Elena looked at her. The apology was not perfect. It was real. She said thank you, and she meant it. And she felt the strangeness of how much those two words could carry when the context had been what it had been. The company town hall was held on a Tuesday afternoon in the main auditorium. Seats full, overflow screens in adjacent rooms, the charged atmosphere of a gathering where nobody is entirely sure what will happen but everyone understands the weight of the occasion. Margaret Lowe spoke first, and she was honest in the specific, uncomfortable ways that institutional honesty requires. She named patterns without obscuring them. She described the conditions that had enabled cruelty without excusing the cruelty. She offered accountability rather than resolution, and acknowledged the difference between the two. Then she introduced Daniel. There was a brief, held pause in the room before the applause began. The kind of pause in which 300 people process the gap between who a person has been to them and who that person actually is. Daniel walked to the stage in his work uniform. He had declined the offer of something more formal, quietly and without explanation, though the explanation was clear to anyone who thought about it for more than a second. Elena was in the front row. As he reached the steps at the side of the stage, he paused, the pause of a man taking a breath before something that matters. Elena stood up. She crossed the short distance to the stage steps and took his hand for a moment, not for the room, not for the cameras, but in the plain, direct way of one person communicating to another that they are not alone in what comes next. He looked at her. He went up. He spoke for less than 4 minutes. He had no notes. He said that most people, at some point in their lives, carry something that no one around them can see: a loss, a failure, a private fear that has nothing to do with how they appear to the world on any given Tuesday morning. He said that the one irreducible thing any person could do for another was to behave as if that invisible weight existed and deserved respect, because it always did, especially when nothing on the surface gave any indication of it. He said he had spent 11 years watching this building from a position that most of the building had decided was beneath their notice, and that what he had seen from that position had taught him more about the cost of cruelty and the value of basic human decency than anything else in his experience. He said he was not angry. He said he was hopeful. Because, in his experience, the people who were capable of cruelty were also almost always capable of being something better, and that the distance between the two versions of themselves was usually nothing more significant than whether anyone had ever asked them to choose. He stepped back from the microphone. He looked at the room, without performance, without request. The room looked back. Then Christine from the 7th floor stood up and began to clap. And then, one by one, and then all at once, the room rose to its feet. The months that followed were neither dramatic nor simple, which is the nature of real change in large institutions. It moves unevenly, with backsliding and resistance, and the persistent friction of habits that have calcified over years. But it moved. Margaret Lowe followed through, and following through meant specific and visible things. A genuine examination of how the building's culture had been functioning, a change in how maintenance staff were referenced in company communications, from nameless building services to people with names and scheduled recognitions, a clear and functional mechanism for raising concerns about behavior like what had been aimed at Daniel and Elena, with consequences that were real. The changes were not perfect. They were not complete. But they were present. And presence is where everything begins. Elena found a new position within 4 months, a marketing director role at a smaller company on the north side of the city, the kind of place where work was visible and credit was distributed with something approaching accuracy. She went into the role with the kind of careful, calibrated attention of someone who has learned to read a room more honestly than she had before. And within her first quarter, she had produced results that reminded her, and others, that what had happened 2 years ago at Hartwell had been a failure of conditions as much as a failure of execution. She thought about Daniel regularly. She called him sometimes on Friday evenings, and they talked the way people talk when they have been honest with each other, in conditions that required honesty, and discovered that the honesty created something durable, a friendship that had been built, unusually, from the inside out. Daniel remained a janitor. This is not a compromise or an irony. It is the truth of a man who had found, in the shape of his days, something that sustained him, and who had never needed the external validation of a different title to understand the value of what he contributed. The building was different now, in the small daily ways he had asked for. People said his name in the hallway. People held the elevator. A new junior analyst named Thomas, who had started in the autumn and knew the story, because everyone at Hartwell knew the story by then, had made a point in his first week of introducing himself to every maintenance staff member on his floor. He had done it with the slight self-consciousness of someone performing a deliberate act, and Daniel had shaken his hand and thanked him without making a production of it, because the point was not the individual gesture so much as the habit the gesture might, over time, become. One evening in February, late, after the building had emptied to its skeleton crew, Elena stopped by on her way home from a dinner nearby. She found Daniel finishing the last of his corridor round on the 14th floor, the cleaning cart at the end of the hall, the floor behind him already dry and reflecting the overhead lights in long, clean lines. She stood in the hallway and looked at him. She thought about the night of the gala, the ballroom, the laughter, the moment she had almost left before any of this had happened. She thought about the chair being pulled out and the way that gesture had landed, not as chivalry or performance, but as a simple, unambiguous communication that she was a person who deserved to sit down without having to justify the space she occupied. She said, "Thank you for the chair that night. I've been meaning to say that more clearly than I have." Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled the small, genuine smile of the kind that doesn't arrive from performance and cannot be manufactured on request. He said, "Everyone deserves a decent seat at the table." He meant it exactly as simply as he said it. In the weeks that followed, a new employee, a young woman named Casey, recently hired to the administrative team, asked a colleague why people seemed to treat the building's maintenance staff with the kind of visible consideration she hadn't encountered in other workplaces. The colleague, who had been at Hartwell for 3 years and had been in the cafeteria on the day of the speech, thought about how to answer. She said, "There was a man here who reminded everyone that dignity doesn't come with a job title, and once you hear something like that from someone who had every reason to stay quiet and every reason to be angry and chose to be neither, it's hard to forget." Casey nodded, without fully understanding yet, the way people nod at things that will become clearer over time. She learned, eventually. Most people in that building did, and for the people who did not learn immediately, there was the quiet, persistent example of a man who arrived each evening at 9:30 and left before dawn, who kept the building's floors clean and its machines running, who had spent 11 years being invisible and had chosen, when the moment came, to be seen not because he needed the acknowledgement, but because someone else needed to see that it was possible to stand up and remain entirely, undramatically, yourself. There is a certain kind of goodness that is never loud. It does not announce itself, does not arrive with credentials, or context, or an audience large enough to make the performance worthwhile. It simply functions in the small, consistent acts of attention that go unrecorded and unacknowledged, in the willingness to see the person at the edge of the room who is hoping not to be noticed, because noticing has always, until now, meant something unkind. It functions in the pulled chair and the held jacket, and the willingness to stand up in a crowded room and say the thing that was true before anyone said it. Sometimes, in rooms full of people who have grown accustomed to a particular kind of emptiness dressed up as entertainment, a single act of plain human decency lands like something from a different world, entirely beautiful and disorienting and quietly exposing, all at once, the distance between what the room has been and what it still has the capacity to become. The room does not always cry because it is sad. Sometimes it cries because it has just seen, for the first time in longer than it can name, what it actually looks like when someone, without audience and without agenda, simply decides to be kind.